The fastest way to lose everything isn't through a storm, a drought, or bad luck. It's when someone convinces the world your name no longer belongs on what your family built. The auctioneer's gavel cracked through the silent courtroom with a sound so sharp it seemed to split the morning in half. Every eye followed the polished wooden hammer as it struck the block one final time. The gallery held its breath. Lawyers stopped writing. Reporters leaned forward. Even the ceiling fans seemed to hum more quietly. Then the clerk unfolded a single sheet of paper and cleared his throat. Ownership of Willow Ridge Estates is hereby transferred to. He paused just long enough for the woman in the front row to smile. Victoria Hayes, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, folded her manicured hands across the designer folder resting on her lap. She looked like someone already celebrating a victory she believed nobody could take away. The subdivision behind her represented nearly 400 luxury homes, miles of freshly paved streets, a private clubhouse, sparkling ponds, and tree-lined sidewalks that brochures described as the perfect American dream. She had spent 2 years posing beside every ribbon-cutting ceremony and every grand opening sign. In her mind, this community was her masterpiece. Then the clerk finished reading. Ethan Walker. My name echoed across the courtroom with enough force to erase every confident expression on Victoria's face. Her smile disappeared before the last syllable faded. I still remember the faint scent of polished oak, fresh coffee drifting from the courthouse hallway, and expensive perfume hanging in the air as dozens of people slowly turned toward me. I stood quietly in the back wearing the same worn leather boots I had walked through my family's fields for most of my life. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. The silence was louder than any celebration could have been. Victoria stared at me as if she had never truly seen me before. That's impossible, she whispered, barely loud enough for the people beside her to hear. But it wasn't impossible. It was inevitable. 3 months earlier, those same people had stood on my land. Without permission, smiling for cameras while congratulating themselves for selling my family's 3,500-acre farm behind my back. They poured concrete where my grandfather once rode horses. They planted decorative maple trees where my father taught me how to repair fences. They renamed dirt roads my family had maintained for generations and replaced them with elegant street signs carrying names invented by marketing consultants. According to every glossy brochure in town, my farm had simply vanished. According to every county website, Willow Ridge Estates had always belonged there. And according to Victoria Hayes, I was just another stubborn rancher refusing to accept progress. She couldn't have been more wrong. Because while everyone admired the brand new homes, admired the fountains, admired the model kitchens and stone entry gates, nobody bothered asking why every moving truck entered through the same narrow country road my grandfather insisted should never be sold. Nobody questioned why one rusted iron gate still carried our family brand burned into the steel decades ago. Nobody wondered why my grandfather refused every offer to remove an old fireproof safe from the farmhouse before he passed away. They all saw empty land waiting to become profit. I saw promises written long before any of them were born. And buried inside those promises was one sentence that would eventually place their entire neighborhood into my hands. My family never measured wealth by the number of dollars sitting in a bank account. We measured it by fence posts that had survived another winter, by calves born every spring, and by whether the creek still ran clear after a heavy Texas thunderstorm. My name is Ethan Walker, and I am the 4th generation to call those 3,500 acres home. My great-grandfather purchased the first section of that land in 1918 after returning from the First World War with little more than determination and a notebook full of plans. Every generation added another piece, another pasture, another barn, until the property stretched farther than I could see from the highest ridge. The smell of fresh-cut hay, diesel fuel, cedar, trees warming under the afternoon sun, and rich black soil after rain became part of my memory long before I understood what ownership truly meant. My grandfather Samuel Walker used to tell me that land was not something you possessed. It was something you borrowed from your grandchildren. Every Saturday morning, he would wake me before sunrise, hand me a pair of worn leather gloves that were much too big for my hands, and we would drive the old pickup across miles of gravel roads checking fences, water troughs, and windmills. The tires always made the same comforting crunch over limestone gravel, and the coffee in his dented metal thermos somehow tasted better out there than anywhere else. He knew every oak tree, every creek bend, every patch of wildflowers that appeared each spring without fail. If a fence leaned an inch, he noticed. If a gate squeaked, he fixed it before lunch. He believed small problems became expensive problems only when people ignored them. Looking back, I realize he was never just talking about fences. One afternoon when I was about 12 years old, he took me inside the oldest building on the ranch, a weathered farmhouse that still smelled faintly of pine boards and old paper. Hidden beneath loose floorboards sat a heavy fireproof safe that looked older than the house itself. He spun the combination slowly, opened the thick steel door, and showed me stacks of yellow documents wrapped carefully in cloth. Deeds, surveys, handwritten letters, and maps covered with careful notes filled every shelf. I reached for one of the rolled blueprints, but he gently shook his head. He smiled instead and pointed toward a single folded map tied with faded leather string. "One day," he said, "someone will think these papers are worth less than concrete. When that day comes, remember something. Never argue with people who only read the newest documents. Let them talk. Let them build. Then show them the oldest page in the room." At the time I laughed because I thought he was telling another one of his mysterious ranch stories. Years later, after he passed away peacefully at the age of 86, those words stayed with me far more clearly than any inheritance meeting ever could. Before leaving for college, I asked him one final question while we watched the sunset paint the fields gold. I wanted to know why he never sold even a single acre when developers offered millions. He looked across the rolling hills, listened to the distant windmill turning in the evening breeze, and quietly answered, "Because the most valuable part of this ranch is the piece nobody thinks to ask about." I did not understand what he meant then. I was about to learn exactly why he smiled when he locked that old safe. By the time I turned 39, the world around our ranch had changed faster than the ranch itself ever did. Glass office buildings replaced old feed stores. Luxury coffee shops stood where hardware stores used to be. Every year, another developer knocked on my door carrying polished brochures and promises that began with the words, "You are sitting on a fortune." I always thanked them for their time before sending them back down the long gravel driveway. Most accepted the answer. One woman never did. Victoria Hayes entered my life the way summer dust rolls across an empty field, slowly enough that you barely notice until everything around you has changed. She drove a pearl-white sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly detailed, even after driving country roads. Every public appearance felt carefully rehearsed. Her smile was warm enough for cameras, but disappeared the moment business entered the conversation. As president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association and one of the most successful real estate brokers in the county, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to hearing the word yes. The first time we met, she stepped out of her vehicle wearing polished boots that had clearly never touched real mud. She looked across thousands of acres of pasture shimmering beneath the Texas sun as if she were already dividing it into lots. The breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass, while cattle grazed peacefully behind the fence. Instead of admiring the landscape, she pulled out architectural renderings showing elegant homes, walking trails, decorative ponds, and a championship clubhouse. She slid the glossy pages across the tailgate of my pickup truck and spoke with perfect certainty. "Families deserve to enjoy land like this," she said. "You could retire tomorrow." I folded the papers, handed them back, and answered with the same calm voice my grandfather always used when negotiations were already over. "Families already enjoy this land. Mine has for more than 100 years. Her smile held for another second before tightening almost invisibly around the edges. She thanked me politely, climbed back into her vehicle, and drove away. I thought that would be the end of it. It was only the beginning. Over the following year, I noticed survey crews lingering near property lines longer than necessary. Expensive drones occasionally hovered above distant fields before disappearing toward the subdivision. County planning meetings suddenly included discussions about future infrastructure expansion remarkably close to my ranch. Neighbors mentioned hearing rumors that I planned to sell everything and relocate. Every rumor sounded more confident than the last, despite never having spoken a single word about selling. Then came the invitation to attend a Willow Ridge community planning event. Curiosity got the better of me. The clubhouse smelled of fresh paint and expensive candles. Large display boards covered the walls, showing artist renderings of future neighborhood phases stretching farther west than the existing homes. I walked slowly from one display to another until my boots stopped moving. There, highlighted in bright green, sat land labeled Future Community Expansion. It was my ranch. Every fence, every pasture, every creek bend had been transformed into parks, lakes, and residential streets on a presentation board as though ownership had already changed hands. Victoria noticed me studying the display and walked over carrying a glass of sparkling water. "You should see this as a compliment," she said with effortless confidence. "Growth always finds the right direction." I looked from the map to her face and quietly replied, "Maps are easy to print. Deeds are harder to replace." She laughed softly, almost as if I had made a charming joke, but something in her eyes shifted before she turned to greet another guest. I left the clubhouse with the faint scent of fresh ink still lingering in the air and a feeling I could not explain. For the first time in my life, the ranch no longer felt like something people wanted to buy. It felt like something they had already decided they owned. 2 weeks after that community meeting, I left for a 12-day agricultural conference in Nebraska. It was the first extended trip I had taken in years, and before I boarded my flight, I walked the ranch one last time, checking gates out of habit more than necessity. The morning air carried the familiar scent of cedar and damp earth, and the windmill turned with its steady metallic rhythm above the eastern pasture. Everything looked exactly as it always had. I asked my ranch manager, Ben Carter, to keep an eye on the cattle, the equipment, and anything unusual near the property line. He laughed and told me the ranch would still be standing when I came home. Neither of us imagined how much could change in less than 2 weeks. My phone stayed busy during the conference with meetings, presentations, and calls from suppliers. So when Ben left 2 voice messages saying there had been survey crews near the south fence, I assumed it was another routine inspection connected to nearby construction. By the time I finally returned his call, he sounded uneasy. He said more trucks had appeared every day. Temporary stakes had been placed across the pasture. Workers claimed they had county authorization. I told him not to confront anyone and promised I would be home the following afternoon. The moment my truck turned onto the county road leading toward the ranch, something felt wrong. The quiet landscape I had known my entire life had been replaced by the constant hum of heavy machinery and backup alarms echoing across the fields. Fresh asphalt carried a sharp chemical smell through the warm afternoon air. Dust drifted over newly cleared ground where tall grass had stood only days before. I pressed harder on the accelerator until I reached the southern entrance. The old wooden gate was gone. In its place stood a temporary chain link barrier with a bright sign that read "Authorized Construction Access Only." Beyond it, bulldozers rolled slowly across land that had belonged to my family for more than a century. New streets had already been carved into the earth. Orange safety fencing outlined future sidewalks. Utility pipes rested in long rows waiting to be buried beneath ground where my grandfather once planted winter wheat. I parked my truck beside the entrance and walked toward the gate. A uniformed security guard stepped forward, holding up one hand politely. "Sir, this is an active construction site. Residents and authorized personnel only." I stared at him, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. "This is the Walker Ranch," I replied. "I own this property." The guard looked down at a digital tablet, scrolled through several pages, then looked back at me with genuine confusion instead of hostility. "According to our records, this parcel was transferred months ago as part of the Willow Ridge expansion project. If you believe there is an error, you will need to contact the project office." His words landed harder than I expected because he honestly believed them. Before I could answer, another pickup truck rolled through the gate without stopping. The company logo on its door matched the development plans I had seen displayed inside the clubhouse. Workers climbed out carrying blueprints, while one of them casually pointed toward a section of pasture where my father's old equipment barn still stood. They discussed utility lines as though my family's history were nothing more than an empty construction zone. I reached for my phone and opened the county property website, expecting to prove the mistake in less than a minute. Instead, the screen loaded a polished digital map that identified the southern section of my ranch as Phase 3 of Willow Ridge Estates. My name was nowhere to be found. For the first time since my great-grandfather purchased that land, the official record told the world it belonged to someone else. The first person I called was the county recorder because I believed there had to be a clerical mistake. Government records do not simply erase 100 years of ownership overnight. At least that was what I kept telling myself during the 40-minute drive into town. The courthouse looked exactly as it always had, with its limestone walls, polished floors, and the faint smell of old paper mixed with furniture polish. Everything about the building suggested stability. Everything except the answers waiting inside. The clerk behind the counter typed my property identification number into her computer, frowned slightly, and turned the monitor toward me. According to the official database, the southern section of my ranch had already been transferred through a series of recorded transactions connected to a development partnership months earlier. Every document carried signatures, filing numbers, and approval stamps that appeared completely legitimate. I requested printed copies, convinced that one obvious error would expose the entire scheme. Instead, every page looked cleaner and more organized than many of the records my own family had preserved for decades. I left carrying a thick folder that somehow proved I no longer owned land I had walked across just 2 weeks earlier. My attorney studied the paperwork for nearly 3 hours before removing his glasses and rubbing his forehead. He admitted something was wrong, but he could not immediately identify where the fraud had occurred because every filing referenced another filing, creating a chain of documents that appeared internally consistent. Someone had not simply forged one signature. They had built an entire paper trail designed to survive casual inspection. We filed emergency objections, requested injunctions, and notified every agency we could think of, but legal procedures moved with careful patience while construction equipment moved every single day. Each morning another section of pasture disappeared beneath fresh gravel. Utility poles appeared where cattle once grazed. Concrete foundations replaced open fields. Every evening I stood behind temporary fencing listening to nail guns, generators, and heavy trucks continue working long after sunset. It felt as though time itself had chosen a side. Friends encouraged me to speak with local reporters, believing public attention might slow the project. I agreed. The interview lasted nearly an hour. I explained my family's history, described the questionable documents, and showed photographs proving the land had belonged to us for generations. When the story aired that evening, only a few seconds of my interview remained. The report focused instead on the economic benefits of the new neighborhood, the hundreds of construction jobs it supported, and interviews with excited future homeowners eager to move into what the anchor called the county's most anticipated community. My concerns were summarized as an ongoing property dispute that officials expected to resolve through normal legal channels. Reading the online comments afterward was harder than I expected. Strangers called me greedy, stubborn, and unwilling to accept progress. Some insisted I was trying to stop young families from buying homes. Others claimed I had probably sold the land and simply regretted the price. None of them knew me. None of them had ever stepped onto the ranch. Yet their opinions spread faster than the truth ever could. Even Ben, who had worked beside my family for nearly 20 years, looked exhausted as we watched another convoy of construction vehicles disappear beyond the new entrance. Quietly, he asked the question I had been trying not to ask myself. What if they actually get away with this? I looked across the growing subdivision, listened to the distant sound of concrete mixers turning, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I did not have an answer. That night, I drove back to the ranch long after the construction crews had gone home. The air had finally cooled, and the only sounds were crickets, distant cattle, and the slow creaking of the old windmill that had watched over this land longer than I had been alive. The lights from the new subdivision glowed across the horizon like a second sunrise, growing brighter every week. I sat on the porch of the farmhouse holding the folder filled with official documents that insisted my family history had been rewritten. Every page carried seals, signatures, and recording numbers. Every page looked convincing. I almost threw the entire stack into the fireplace. Instead, I remembered my grandfather's voice. Never argue with people who only read the newest documents. Show them the oldest page in the room. I walked inside the empty farmhouse where the familiar scent of aged pine, machine oil, and old books still lingered in the quiet air. Moonlight stretched across the wooden floor as I knelt beside the loose floorboards exactly where I had almost forgotten they existed. The heavy steel safe waited beneath them, untouched since the day we buried my grandfather. My hands hesitated on the combination dial because opening that door felt less like searching for paperwork and more like asking him for advice one last time. The lock clicked open with the same deep metallic sound I remembered from childhood. Inside, every document remained carefully wrapped in faded cloth exactly as he had left it. I spread everything across the dining table. Original deeds, hand-drawn surveys, tax receipts, easement agreements, water rights, mineral leases that had expired decades earlier. Most people would have seen nothing more than dusty papers covered in fading ink. I noticed something different. Every document referenced another document, creating a history that reached back more than 100 years. Then I found the folded survey tied with the worn leather string my grandfather had pointed to all those years ago. Carefully unfolding it, I watched the brittle paper reveal a remarkably detailed map dated 1919. Unlike the digital county maps, this survey showed every fence line, creek crossing, wagon trail, and recorded easement exactly as they existed when the property was first assembled. My eyes stopped at one narrow strip of land running along the eastern boundary. It measured only 60 feet wide, hardly noticeable among thousands of acres. Yet every notation surrounding it had been written with unusual precision. Attached behind the survey was a separate easement agreement stating that the Walker family retained permanent ownership and exclusive control of the only legally recorded access corridor connecting the surrounding properties to the county highway. I unfolded the newest development maps beside the century-old survey. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing because the answer became impossible to ignore. Every entrance into Willow Ridge Estates had been constructed directly over that same 60-foot corridor. The developers had paved it, landscaped it, installed decorative lighting, and built impressive stone entrance walls, but they had never acquired the underlying access rights. They had focused on subdivision boundaries, lot lines, and construction permits while assuming the oldest easement no longer mattered. Suddenly, my grandfather's final words made perfect sense. The most valuable part of the ranch was never the pastures, the barns, or the rolling hills. It was the narrow piece of land nobody thought to ask about because it looked too small to matter. I leaned back in the old wooden chair as the first rays of sunrise slipped through the farmhouse windows. Outside, I could already hear construction trucks beginning another day of work. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I did not feel angry. I did not feel defeated. I felt patient. They believed they were building their greatest success. They had no idea they were building it on the one piece of paper my grandfather had protected for more than half a century. HOA, most people think winning a legal battle means filing the biggest lawsuit as quickly as possible. My grandfather believed the opposite. He used to say that timing wins more cases than anger ever will. As the sun climbed over the ranch that morning, I carefully returned every original document to the safe except the 1919 survey and the easement agreement. Those stayed with me, not because I intended to march into court that afternoon, but because I finally understood something Victoria and her attorneys did not. They believed they had already reached the finish line. In reality, they had not even reached the starting point. My attorney stared at the century-old survey for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word. He compared it with the newest county plats, zoning maps, subdivision filings, and recorded easements until he finally leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time. Since this nightmare had begun, he explained that ownership of the access corridor had never been legally transferred, abandoned, or extinguished. The developers had assumed newer subdivision approvals automatically replaced older recorded property rights. They did not. The entrance road, every utility line beneath it, and every permanent access easement still depended on a document recorded more than 100 years earlier. Then he gave me unexpected advice. Do nothing, he said. Those two words sounded completely unreasonable. Every instinct told me to stop construction immediately. Instead, he explained that the more money invested before the legal issue surfaced, the stronger our position would become. Every additional sidewalk, every completed driveway, every occupied home increased the value resting upon an access corridor they did not actually control. So I waited. It became the hardest decision of my life. Week after week, I watched moving trucks roll beneath the stone entrance walls built across my family's easement. Children rode bicycles along freshly paved streets. Landscapers planted rows of maple trees beside decorative fountains. Families unpacked furniture and waved to new neighbors who believed they had found their forever homes. I never blamed the residents. They had purchased houses in good faith. They were not my enemies. The problem had always been the people who convinced everyone that paperwork could erase history. While the neighborhood celebrated grand openings, my attorney and I quietly assembled a different kind of project. We hired independent surveyors to retrace the original boundary markers described in the 1919 records. Rusted iron pins hidden beneath decades of soil appeared exactly where my grandfather's survey said they would. We located archived county meeting minutes confirming the easement had never been vacated. We obtained certified copies of every deed recorded since the First World War. Each new discovery strengthened the chain instead of weakening it. At the same time, another opportunity appeared without anyone paying much attention. The development company had borrowed heavily to finance the newest construction phases, and rising interest rates placed unexpected pressure on its lenders. Through a private investment group that had worked with my family's agricultural business for years, I quietly purchased a portion of the distressed deed. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic speeches, no raised voices, and no surprise witnesses rushing through the doors at the last second. There was only the steady sound of pages turning, keyboards clicking, and the low hum of the air conditioning above polished wooden benches. Victoria Hay sat confidently beside the attorneys representing the development company and the homeowners association. She greeted reporters with the same practiced smile I had seen at every groundbreaking ceremony, as though this hearing were simply another formality standing between her and another victory. I carried only one leather portfolio into the courtroom. Inside it rested copies of the documents my grandfather had protected for decades. The original papers remained safely locked inside the old farmhouse where they belonged. My attorney began by asking the court to compare the recorded subdivision plats with the original 1919 survey. Large maps appeared on display screens throughout the courtroom. At first, they looked nearly identical except for modern roads and property lines. Then the surveyor traced a narrow 60-foot strip stretching from the county highway into the heart of Willow Ridge Estates. Every entrance road, every underground utility corridor, every permanent access point crossed that same historic easement. Certified county archives confirmed it had never been released, relocated, or transferred. One by one, additional records appeared. Original deeds, tax records, survey notes, archived commission minutes. Each document matched the next with remarkable precision. The developers argued that newer approvals superseded older records. The county survey expert calmly explained that zoning approval did not eliminate recorded property rights. A transportation engineer confirmed there was no alternative legal access route serving the subdivision. A title specialist testified that every subsequent transaction had relied upon the mistaken assumption that the access corridor had been conveyed decades earlier when no such conveyance had ever occurred. I watched Victoria's confidence slowly disappear as each carefully prepared presentation answered questions before her attorneys could even ask them. Then my attorney introduced the financial records. Quietly and without fanfare, he explained that through legally acquired investment interests, I now held a controlling position in the distressed debt secured by the development project after the original lender transferred portions of the outstanding obligations during restructuring. The courtroom became noticeably still. The legal issue was no longer limited to an easement dispute. The project depended upon access rights controlled by my family and financing interests that had lawfully changed hands. Settlement discussions that had been ignored for months suddenly became urgent. After several days of testimony and negotiations supervised by the court, the final agreement reflected what the documents had demonstrated from the very beginning. The disputed transfers affecting my family's property were set aside, the historic access rights were fully recognized, and the financial restructuring placed operational control of the development under my ownership through a court-approved process. Nobody cheered when the judge signed the final order. There was only quiet acceptance that the paperwork had finally caught up with reality. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Victoria asking how everything had unraveled so completely. She offered no answer. I walked past the cameras without saying a word because there was nothing left to explain. The oldest page in the room had done all the talking, just as my grandfather always knew it would. The first thing I did after the court order became final was drive through the stone entrance that everyone believed symbolized someone else's success. The late afternoon sun reflected across the decorative pond. Children laughed as they rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and neighbors waved to each other while collecting their mail. Looking around, I realized something important. None of these families had stolen my land. They had trusted paperwork, advertisements, and promises made by people who claimed to know what they were doing. They deserved stability, not another battle. During the first community meeting under the new ownership, the clubhouse felt completely different from the last time I had walked through its doors. The expensive candles still filled the lobby with the same artificial fragrance, and the polished floors still reflected the overhead lights, but the atmosphere had changed. Instead of polished sales presentations, people wanted honest answers. I stood at the front of the room wearing the same worn leather boots I had worn into court and explained exactly what had happened. I showed copies of the historic survey, the easement agreement, and the court order. I told every homeowner that their houses were not my enemy, and neither were they. The applause that followed was quiet, respectful, and filled more with relief than celebration. Over the next several months, we dissolved the old homeowners association structure and replaced it with a transparent neighborhood council where financial records, maintenance contracts, and meeting minutes were available for every resident to review. Unnecessary fees disappeared. Landscaping contracts were competitively bid instead of quietly renewed. Reserve funds were independently audited. The entrance sign stayed exactly where it was because communities are built by families, not by lawsuits. Meanwhile, investigations into the development transactions continued through the appropriate legal and regulatory channels. I never celebrated anyone else's legal troubles because that was never the point. My grandfather had taught me that justice was about restoring what was right, not humiliating people who made the wrong choices. One Saturday morning, several weeks after everything had settled, I unlocked the old farmhouse one more time. Dust floated through the sunlight exactly as it always had. The safe still rested beneath the loose floorboards, waiting patiently like it had for decades. I carefully returned the 1919 survey to its place beside the original deeds and locked the heavy steel door. As I spun the combination for the final time, I smiled because I finally understood why my grandfather never worried when developers came offering fortunes. He was never protecting acres. He was protecting truth. Outside, I climbed into my pickup truck and followed the familiar gravel road toward the eastern pasture. The old iron gate still carried our family brand burned into the steel. Beyond it, cattle grazed peacefully beneath the same wide Texas sky that my great-grandfather first looked upon more than a century earlier. In the distance, I could see the neighborhood standing beside the ranch instead of replacing it. The land had room for both because respect had finally replaced arrogance. Every small detail my grandfather insisted on preserving, from a forgotten survey to a narrow 60-foot corridor that everyone else ignored, had quietly carried our family's future through generations. That is why I no longer believe the strongest foundation is concrete or stone. It is a promise that refuses to disappear simply because someone else prints a newer map. Justice does not need to shout across a courtroom or dominate the evening news. It waits inside forgotten records, patient hands, and people willing to protect what is right until the truth finally has its turn to speak. And when that day comes, the oldest page in the room will always be stronger than the newest lie.